The sun was bright over the small town of Brooklyn the morning everything changed, but the light did nothing to soften the storm that was quietly building on the asphalt outside the old diner. It began with the sound of a single motorcycle engine rumbling like a warning in the summer air, followed by dozens more lining up behind it. People inside the diner pressed their faces to the windows, watching with anxious curiosity as a row of patched, battle-hardened bikers parked in perfect formation, their boots hitting the ground like thunder. At the front stood a massive rider with a scar across his brow and eyes that looked like they had seen the worst parts of life yet still held onto something human. His name was Riker, and that morning, he had come for justice. Not violence, justice. And the two old men who stepped out of a black luxury sedan had no idea what kind of truth they were about to face under the unforgiving daylight. If you believe kindness, courage, and second chances can still change the world, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe to Counter to support more stories like this. Riker wasn't always the leader of the Iron Vows motorcycle club, but years ago, after losing his younger sister Mara to a bad chain of events caused by greed and manipulation, he had vowed to spend his life protecting those who couldn't protect themselves. That promise had brought him here today. The two older men approaching the diner, Silas Grant and Leonard Pierce, were wealthy real estate partners who had built their empire by cutting corners, evicting families, and bribing officials. Their latest target was a small community shelter run by a widow named Rosa, who had been fighting to keep her doors open for the kids and elderly people who depended on her. Rosa's late husband, Matteo, had once saved Riker's life after a motorcycle accident back when Riker was just a reckless teenager with no direction. Helping Rosa wasn't a favor. It was a debt of the heart. Silas and Leonard had threatened Rosa with fabricated code violations and impossible fines just to force her to sell the shelter building so they could demolish it and build a luxury plaza. They thought no one would stand up to them. They thought Rosa was alone. They had no idea that an entire club of riders, men and women who had once been broken themselves, had chosen to stand behind her. And they certainly didn't expect Riker, with his tattoos, leather vest, and intimidating presence, to be the one who would confront them under the bright morning sun. As Silas and Leonard walked toward the diner to meet a lawyer for paperwork, Riker stepped forward, stopping them cold. Behind him, the Iron Vows stood silently, arms crossed, their motorcycles gleaming like steel witnesses. Silas tried to hide the nervous flicker in his eyes as he clutched a thick envelope, papers meant to push the shelter into foreclosure. Leonard muttered something under his breath, already annoyed by the presence of the bikers. They still believed they were safe behind wealth and status. They were wrong. Riker wasn't interested in threats or shouting. Instead, he pulled out a folder he had been carrying for days, proof collected by members of the club who had followed the men, interviewed tenants, and tracked down documents they had discarded carelessly. Inside were records of illegal inspections, predatory agreements, and misused funds. Each page was a scar, every line of text a wound inflicted on people who had trusted them. Riker held the folder out to them, and though Silas reached for it with false confidence, his hands trembled slightly. As he flipped through the evidence, his face shifted from irritation to disbelief, then to fear. Leonard leaned in, pale as the morning sky. The crowd outside the diner began to grow, workers from nearby shops, families passing by, Rosa herself, her hands wringing nervously as she watched. The truth was no longer hidden inside boardrooms or buried behind legal jargon. It was out in the open, and the daylight made it impossible to deny. Riker calmly told them that copies of everything inside the folder had already been sent to the media, the mayor, and every tenant they had wronged. The bikers behind him weren't threatening violence, they were witnesses to a moral reckoning. They were the kind of people Silas and Leonard had always underestimated, people with nothing to lose except the last pieces of their own humanity. Silas tried to speak, but his voice cracked as he realized how much damage he had done over the years without ever facing consequences. Leonard's shoulders sank, his arrogance dissolving under the weight of accountability. The bikers didn't yell, they didn't push, they didn't intimidate. They simply stood there with the quiet strength of people who had endured their own battles and refused to let injustice win again. The silence was heavier than shouting could ever be. When Rosa stepped forward, tears gathering in her eyes, Riker gently placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. Silas and Leonard, suddenly stripped of their power, found themselves looking at the faces of the very people they had tried to hurt. The shame hit them harder than any fist ever could. And for the first time, they seemed genuinely remorseful. In front of the entire town, they agreed to withdraw their claims, restore the shelter's funding, and submit to the investigations that would hold them accountable. As the sun rose higher, warming the pavement beneath everyone's feet, something remarkable happened. Silas and Leonard didn't flee. They didn't argue. They stayed, listening as Rosa explained how the shelter had started, how her husband had rebuilt it twice, how children found safety there after school, how elderly tenants depended on its meals. Her voice trembled with every memory, but she stood tall, supported by Riker's steady presence and the quiet strength of the bikers behind him. And for once, the two men truly heard her. When they finally walked away, they weren't the same. They looked smaller, older, humbled, and quieter than they had ever been. And the riders, their engines roaring once again, escorted Rosa safely back to the shelter, not as rebels, not as outlaws, but as guardians of a community that deserved better. If this story touched your heart, please like, comment, share, and subscribe to Kindness Corner to help us spread more stories of courage and compassion. Before the ending, please comment below, kindness always wins. With the town watching, with daylight revealing every truth that had once lived in the shadows, the biker gang didn't just teach two corrupted old men a lesson. They showed everyone what real strength looks like, the strength to stand up, to protect, to forgive, and to choose justice without losing one's humanity. And as Rosa opened the shelter doors that afternoon, greeted by children running into her arms, Riker and the Iron